The park was quiet that afternoon, the golden sun casting long shadows over the playground. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of children's laughter and the rhythmic creak of swings in motion. Birds chirped from the branches, and for a while, everything felt peaceful. But not for him. Near the swings, a small group of boys stood in a loose circle, their voices low but sharp. In the middle of them, a kid maybe 10 or 11 stood, with his shoulders hunched, gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His head was down, his gaze fixed on the dirt beneath his sneakers. But even without looking up, he could feel the sneers, the smirks, the quiet but cruel amusement in their eyes. "Where you going, loser?" One of the boys, taller than the rest, stepped closer, blocking the kid's way. He didn't answer. He knew better than to answer. The wrong words could make things worse. Another boy chuckled. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" A shove, not hard enough to knock him down, but enough to make him stumble, enough to let him know they could do worse. Laughter followed sharp, mean, feeding off his fear. And then, everything changed. A deep, unmistakable voice cut through the taunts like a knife, smooth and steady, but carrying the kind of weight that made people listen. "You sure you want to do that?" Silence. The boys turned, their smug expressions vanishing in an instant. Standing just a few feet away was a man they all recognized, even before their brains fully processed it. Dwayne, "The Rock" Johnson. He stood there, arms crossed, watching them with a look that wasn't angry but wasn't amused either. His eyebrow lifted slightly, his gaze locked onto them, measuring them, judging them. The tallest boy, the leader's, wallowed hard. His face paled just slightly. We were just messing around." His voice had lost its edge, the false confidence draining from him with every passing second. The Rock took a slow step forward, then another. His towering frame cast a shadow over the group, making them shrink without him even saying another word. "Messing around?" he repeated, his voice even controlled. "That what you call it?" The boy hesitated. No one spoke. Jason, the kid in the middle, finally dared to look up. His heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe it. The Rock was talking to him. And in that moment, everything shifted. The bullies shifted on their feet, suddenly unsure of themselves. A moment ago, they had been in control-awing, sneering, pushing their weight around like it meant something. But now, they weren't so sure. The Rock didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to threaten. He just stood there, exuding the kind of presence that made grown men rethink their decisions. And these kids, they weren't grown men. "You guys ever hear of respect?" The Rock asked, folding his massive arms across his chest. His voice was too calm. "Or is that not a thing anymore?" The leader of the group, the tallest one, swallowed but didn't answer. One of the smaller boys, clearly the least confident of the group, mumbled, "We didn't mean—" The Rock's gaze snapped to him. "Didn't mean what?" His voice didn't rise, but something about it made the kid stiffen. "Didn't mean to get caught?" Silence. No one answered. No one even breathed. Jason, still clutching the straps of his backpack, looked between them. He wanted to say something, but years of knowing what happened when you talked back held him still. The Rock turned his attention to him. His expression softened, just slightly. "You," he said, nodding toward the boy. "What's your name?" Jason hesitated. He wasn't used to being noticed. He wasn't used to someone, especially someone like this, asking. "Jason," he said quietly. The Rock nodded, as if committing it to memory. "Jason," he repeated, his voice gentler now. "You okay?" Jason nodded quickly. Too quickly. The Rock wasn't buying it. "You don't have to pretend," he said. "It's okay to be mad. It's okay to stand up for yourself, but not like this." He gestured slightly toward the bullies. "Not by becoming them." Jason blinked. He hadn't thought of it that way. The Rock turned back to the group, his expression shifting once again, calm, controlled, but carrying weight. "Now here's the deal," he said, his voice steady. "You're going to apologize. Right now." The leader hesitated. His pride was still there, fighting to hold on. "Or what?" he challenged, trying to sound tough. And that's when The Rock smiled. Not the kind of smile that meant things were okay. Not the kind of smile you wanted to see. The bully hesitated. A long second stretched into two. His friends shifted on their feet, stealing quick glances at one another. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to be the one to back down. But The Rock wasn't moving, wasn't looking away. And he was waiting. The Rock pointed at him. "Next time you see someone else in your spot, someone being pushed around, someone feeling like they don't matter, you be the guy who steps in." Jason felt the weight of those words settle over him. The Rock wasn't just saying it, he meant it. And Jason knew, without a doubt, that he would. As The Rock walked away, Jason stood frozen, still gripping the wristband in his hand. It wasn't just a piece of rubber. It meant something. It was proof that today had been different. Proof that he had been seen. Proof that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as powerless as he had always believed. He turned the band over between his fingers, reading the words again. "Blood, sweat, respect. The first two you give, the last one you earn." Jason exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure if he had earned respect yet, but for the first time, he felt like he was on his way. The bullies? They had left different than they came. Humbled, thinking. They hadn't walked away with the same arrogant smirks on their faces. They had walked away quiet, reflective, and maybe that was a start. Because strength wasn't about tearing others down. It wasn't about proving who was better. It was about lifting yourself and the people around you. And Jason? Jason felt different. He walked toward the swings where he had dropped his backpack earlier, slinging it over his shoulder. But this time, his grip was lighter. His shoulders weren't hunched. He wasn't carrying the same weight he had before. For so long, he had thought being strong meant fighting back, pushing, shoving, proving you weren't weak. But that wasn't it at all. Strength was about knowing who you were, standing your ground, believing in yourself even when no one else did. And maybe that was the real lesson. Because when things get tough, you have two choices. You either stand your ground or you walk away. But if you walk away, don't pretend you won. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories. The Rock watched them all carefully, nodding each time. He wasn't mocking them. He wasn't laughing. But he was watching, studying. Jason stood at the back of the group, his hands clenched into fists, his stomach twisted into knots. He had never been strong. Never been the kid who excelled at sports or impressed people with his physical abilities. And now he was about to embarrass himself in front of The Rock. He felt his heart hammer against his ribs as The Rock turned toward him. "Your turn, Jason." Jason's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to shake his head, to back away, to disappear. I can't do that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Rock didn't look disappointed. He didn't shake his head or sigh like Jason had already failed. Instead, he crouched down to Jason's level, his voice calm but firm. "Not yet," The Rock said. "But you will." Jason swallowed hard. He wanted to believe that. He really did. But how? As if reading his mind, The Rock continued. "You think I was always strong?" He smiled slightly. "I wasn't. I was just a kid like you once. And you know what made the difference?" Jason shook his head. "Consistency," The Rock said. "Putting in the work. Every single day. You don't wake up strong, you earn it." Jason looked up at the bar again. It seemed impossibly high. But when he looked back at The Rock, something shifted inside him. Maybe, for the first time, he believed it was possible. With a deep breath, he stepped forward. His hands gripped the cold metal. His feet left the ground. And he tried. When it was over, the bullies weren't laughing anymore. They weren't sneering, smirking, or whispering under their breath. The cocky attitude they had carried just minutes ago was gone, replaced by something else, something unfamiliar. Respect. They had all stepped up to the challenge, and none of them had done as well as they thought they would. Some barely made it past 2 pull-ups, others didn't even complete one. The Rock hadn't mocked them. He hadn't called them weak or told them they weren't good enough. He had just watched, measuring them in a way that wasn't about who was stronger at that moment, but about who had the mindset to become stronger. And Jason? Jason had tried. He had gripped the bar, arms straining, his body trembling as he fought to pull himself up. He didn't make it, not even halfway, but he had tried. And somehow, that mattered more. The Rock clapped the leader of the bullies on the shoulder. "Not bad," he said, his voice steady. "But next time?" He leaned in just slightly. "Use that strength for something good." The boy hesitated, then nodded, and this time he actually meant it. Jason wiped his hands on his jeans, his breathing still heavy from the effort. But something had changed inside him. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't humiliated. He felt different. Stronger, not because he had succeeded, but because he had shown up. The Rock turned to him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he reached down and ruffled Jason's hair like an older brother would. "You've got heart, kid," he said. "That's what matters." Jason exhaled, his chest swelling with something unfamiliar. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel small. The air felt different now. The tension that had once filled the park had shifted. Gone was the humiliation, the fear, the weight pressing down on Jason's chest. He wasn't sure what had changed exactly. Maybe it was the fact that the bullies weren't sneering anymore. Maybe it was because, for the first time, he had tried without immediately expecting failure. Or maybe it was just because the Rock had seen him, not as a victim, not as someone weak, but as someone who could be strong. The Rock clapped his hands together as if shaking off the last bit of the moment. "All right," he said, glancing at the group. "I think that's enough life lessons for one afternoon." Jason felt a strange pang in his chest. He knew this was just another random Tuesday for the Rock. He'd probably forget about this whole thing by the time he walked back to his car. But for Jason, this moment would stick with him forever. And then, the Rock did something Jason didn't expect. He reached down, pulled off the black wristband he was wearing, and held it out. Jason blinked. "What?" "Take it," the Rock said. Jason hesitated before reaching out. The wristband was simple, just a thick rubber band with small embossed letters along the side. He turned it over in his hands, reading the words, "Blood, sweat, respect. The first 2 you give, the last one you earn." His throat tightened. "That's a reminder," the Rock said, his voice steady, "to keep going, to never let anyone make you feel small." Jason swallowed hard. "Thanks." "Anytime," the Rock said, then winked. He turned to leave, but after a few steps he paused. "Just promise me one thing." Jason looked up. "What?" One eyebrow lifted just a fraction, but the effect was instant. The leader of the group swallowed hard. His confidence, so solid just moments ago, was crumbling under the Rock's stare. Sorry," he muttered, barely above a whisper. The Rock tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "Nah, try again." The boy's throat tightened, his cheeks flushed. His friends weren't backing him up. Not this time. He glanced at Jason, then back at the Rock, and something inside him shifted. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." This time, it was real. The Rock studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Better." Then he turned to Jason. "Now, Jason," he said, his voice softer but still firm, "you accept that apology." Jason hesitated. He didn't know what the right answer was. Did he have to accept it? The kid had humiliated him, shoved him, made him feel small. He wasn't sorry a minute ago, he was just scared. I guess," Jason muttered, his fingers still curled around his backpack straps. The Rock's grin was immediate, and not in a way that made Jason feel like he had given the right answer. "Wrong answer." Jason blinked. "What?" The Rock crouched slightly, leveling his gaze with Jason's. He didn't look mad. He didn't look disappointed. But he did look like someone who had been through this before. "You forgive people, not because they deserve it," The Rock said, his tone quiet but powerful, "but because you do." Jason's brows knitted together. "You let it go," The Rock continued, "so it doesn't weigh you down." Jason thought about that. He thought about all the times he'd gone home, furious at the world, at these kids, at himself. He thought about the times he had played every cruel word over in his head, wishing he had said something different, wishing he had done something different. And for the first time, he realized how heavy that felt. His grip loosened on his backpack straps. He let out a small breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then finally he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I get it." And for the first time, The Rock smiled. Just when the boys thought it was over, when the tension had started to ease, when they thought they could slink away and forget this ever happened, The Rock did something they didn't expect. He crossed his massive arms over his chest and smirked. "All right," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a challenge. "Now let's see what you guys got." The bullies frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" the leader asked cautiously. The Rock turned his head slightly, then pointed toward a set of pull-up bars standing tall near the playground. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, the bars high enough that most kids had to jump to reach them. "You guys like to push people around," The Rock said. "Let's see if you can actually do something." The boys exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't what they expected. They had been prepared for a lecture, maybe another intimidating stare-down. But this was something else. One of the boys, the smaller one, cleared his throat. "You mean like exercise?" The Rock nodded. "That's right. Show me what you got." The leader of the group scoffed, forcing a smirk. He straightened his shoulders like he wasn't fazed, even though the look in his eyes said otherwise. "That's easy," he muttered. "I can do a ton of pull-ups." The Rock raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" The other boys stayed quiet, waiting to see what would happen next. The leader hesitated for a second, then walked toward the bars. The others followed, and after a moment, so did Jason. The Rock strolled behind them, casual but in control, like he already knew how this was going to play out. The leader jumped up first, gripping the bar with both hands. His arms tensed as he pulled himself up, his chin barely clearing the metal. 1, 2. On the third rep, his arms started to shake. By the fourth, he was struggling. The Rock watched, nodding slightly. "Not bad," he said, his tone neutral. "Let's see the rest of you." One by one, the other boys took their turn. Most barely managed 2 or 3 pull-ups before dropping down, breathless and embarrassed. Jason stood at the back, unsure. He had never been strong, never been the athletic type. He wasn't even sure he could do one. The Rock turned to him. "Your turn, Jason." Jason's stomach tightened. I can't do that." The Rock kneeled slightly, lowering his voice so only Jason could hear. "Not yet," he said, "but you will." And for the first time, Jason believed him. The challenge was set. One by one, the boys stepped up to the pull-up bar. The first kid jumped up and gripped the metal, his arms shaking almost immediately. He managed 2 pull-ups before his grip gave out and he dropped to the ground, breathing hard. The Rock nodded. Not bad. The next kid barely managed one. The third boy, smaller than the rest, got halfway up before letting go, his face red with effort.